I could go ahead and introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Andrew Perrett, who studied medicine at Cambridge University and qualified as a GP before spending 18 years working in clinical practice and medical education in China. But he now works as a GP in Cambridge. He's a fellow of the Royal College of General Practitioners, holds a postgraduate certificate in medical education from the University of Dundee and a diploma in biblical studies from Spurgeon's College. He's currently completing a master's in bioethics and medical law at St Mary's University, London. So I will hand over to Andrew to talk to us about bioethics.
So thank you for the introduction, and of course Sarah does know me fairly well, so I can say that that was all accurate. Thank you. Okay, so what are we going to do for the next half an hour? I thought we would think through what is this topic of bioethics, look at some of the ethical theories and think about how they sit alongside or with a biblical worldview. And then I was going to present a very simple, practical framework which could be useful to approach bioethical dilemmas before going through a few case examples with you as part of the talk. And then we'll have the opportunity to break out into small groups as before. And I've got a couple of example cases. But you could also look at real situations that you're puzzling through yourselves, as long as you can share the information without revealing who's involved, of course. And then we'll come back together as previously. So what is bioethics? As I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, here am I, a doctor speaking to some church leaders. Probably I'm the least educated in Greek in the room, but you'll all be aware that bio means to do with living systems, and the ethos has that sense of customs and habits, but also character or disposition. But of course, the word is getting at the idea of how we should behave, how to live well, to live in a good way, and it comes to our rights and responsibilities. What is good for both individuals and for all of us as a society. And it can be used in different ways. So it can be used in a simply descriptive way. So for example, there are papers being written about the effects of new laws on euthanasia and what is happening in countries like the Netherlands or in the state of Oregon. And those are describing what is happening in real life. But it can also be used in a more prescriptive way, which is trying to sort of give us a language of right and wrong. When we make these decisions, how do we know what is good and what is bad? So that's interesting, because when we look at modern definitions of bioethics, it feels like a moral philosophy that's now trying to stand on its own feet. It's trying to be a science. And it's trying particularly not to align itself with any worldview, not just Christianity, but any specific worldview, which is a slightly delicate thing to attempt, because of course a lot of the ideas come from the religions and cultures that it's trying to separate itself from. And so there's a lot of use of, you could call them philosophical floaters, words like dignity and respect and humane treatment, which everyone can agree on, more or less, as long as nobody defines them too carefully or closely. So you could say that it's got its feet planted firmly in midair. It's not really on the ground, but definitely trying to avoid heaven. Bioethics is also not law. So it's easy to think of actions that are ethical but illegal. So for example, it is illegal to store a frozen embryo indefinitely. There's a time limit in the UK. And it's also easy to think of legal but unethical actions. So it's quite legal to pass by a child drowning in a puddle without helping. So what it's not. The areas in which as a conversation tend to be the beginning of life, the end of life, and the imitation of human function or human life. And you'll all be aware of the controversies in this area. But I want to move on to some of the main frameworks for looking at ethical questions. And these major streams would be the idea of duty. You've probably heard of Kant's concept of the categorical imperative. What must we do? A moral obligation or duty that's universally binding and unconditional. So he says, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it would be a universal law. Perhaps things like do not steal. And then virtue is a word that we might associate with Aristotle and his golden mean, the path of courage, of course, lying somewhere between recklessness and cowardice. But the picture here is of Alistair MacIntyre, the author of After Virtue. The idea here is that good action follows good character. So, for example, if I leap like a goalkeeper and push a child to the ground, normally, of course, that would be a bad action, unless I'm pushing the child out of the path of an oncoming car. So the question that's being asked with virtue ethics is what was my intention? And then there's the consequentialist model made popular by Bentham and Mill. And within that, particularly the idea of utility. This is a results-oriented way of looking at things. And the phrase you may have heard before is the idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or that could be rephrased as the greatest good for the greatest number. And that drives a lot of the thinking we hear about in the news at the moment, of course, when it comes to lockdown and quarantine rules and so on. And the idea there is that although some people lose out, others gain, and there are more winners than losers. But of course, this concept doesn't necessarily work very well if some people are not playing by the rules. So if we think about these three major streams, how should we act? This is perhaps the easiest to see in terms of a biblical worldview. Kant himself was trying to separate his philosophical ideas from his faith, but not everyone is convinced that he managed to do that very successfully. But the idea of treating other people as ends and not as means sounds a little bit like the golden rule. The problem with duty is, of course, that it's quite difficult to say why we must do anything in the end without God, just as Sartre struggled to think why he should help the little old lady cross the road next to him rather than push her over with his nihilist view of things. He couldn't quite hang that together. And in terms of our biblical worldview, it's pretty obvious in terms of law. We've got the Ten Commandments, the idea of God as king. What's interesting is that the utilitarian way of thinking things, this can be a very powerful tool, and of course it could be used to justify anything because the focus is on the ends and the means don't matter. And so the problem with that, this is how people would justify all sorts of outrages such as rendition and torture by secret services and so on. And in fact, some legal systems have specifically addressed this. So, for example, the idea of shooting down a hijacked plane to prevent another 911 has specifically been prohibited under German law because it's unfair to the passengers on board. But the idea of utility, it doesn't sound quite so obviously biblical until we think about the idea of self-sacrifice, which of course is intrinsic to following Jesus. And we're told to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. That principle that unless the kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed, but if it dies, produces many seeds. And of course, it's the essence of the atonement. But it's interesting comparing when Jesus says, I must die, with when Caiaphas says it's better that one man should die. And so, of course, the question of self-sacrifice versus volunteering someone else is important. The third stream is virtue. So with the virtue model, the question is how would a good person behave? And this is perhaps something which we would naturally think of within a biblical worldview. But it also can be looked at in two ways, because, of course, a biblical understanding will tell us that no one is completely good. And so if there's no one righteous, then it's not actually possible all the time in all ways to act justly, show mercy, and walk humbly. But the idea of intention lies behind quite a lot of the wisdom books, both positively in terms of the ideas of wisdom in books like Proverbs, but also negatively. And Alistair MacIntyre picked up that there's a sense of a lack of purpose that perhaps we could think of as resembling Ecclesiastes behind modern bioethics, a sort of hopelessness and meaninglessness. So with all these three different streams, the question is, well, how do we put them together in real life? Some of you may have heard of the case of Dr. Bhargava. A 6-year-old boy died under her care, and it was deemed quite reasonably that important results had been missed and the care could have been better. But at different stages over the last many years, the way in which her actions have been viewed has slightly changed. So initially, it was deemed that she had failed professionally. So perhaps that is predominantly looking at it from a duty point of view. But subsequently, she was actually convicted as a criminal for gross negligence manslaughter. And so she went to work one day trying to look after lots and lots of patients, one of whom died, and ended up a convicted criminal. And so the question is that, what's the reason for that? And some people would look at that as a utilitarian way of approaching things, that she's been sacrificed in order to remind all doctors everywhere to practice properly. But later that was overturned, perhaps recognizing that her intention was good. And so from a virtue point of view, she didn't deserve to be treated as a criminal. So putting all these streams together in real life isn't always easy, and the decisions that are made seem to be sometimes reversed in difficult cases. In medicine, which is my day job, a lot of people will approach ethical problems from a principles point of view. So this is not so much looking at it just in terms of duty or intention or results, but using these classic 4 principles that come out of the book by Beecher and Childress. The problem with this is that it's still difficult to put them all together. So, for example, if you wanted to provide adoption services exclusively for heterosexual couples, that would be illegal because it's deemed to be unjust, and yet it's clearly thoroughly beneficent to do so. So these principles can conflict quite readily. And the other problem with these principles is that the one principle of autonomy has come to dominate massively in particularly so-called Western countries. And in fact, Foster in 2010, he quoted a conversation by some medical ethicists in an Oxford pub who said, in most cases, there's only one relevant principle, autonomy. All that you ever have to do is to decide what the patient's autonomous wishes are, and then do them in a way that won't affront the lawyers. So that's perhaps a bit shocking. Having worked in Asia, We might think that in a more social, family-minded society that this is not true, but I would suggest that it is still often true in that context, but the autonomy is not so much the autonomy of an individual, but the autonomy of a group. We heard earlier from Charmaine about the idea of Ubuntu, which was interesting to me because this pushes us back to the idea of being responsible and being a part of creation and so on, as we were discussing earlier. And this is a pointer, I think, to the contrasting principles if we're looking at things from a biblical point of view. And I think it's interesting to see both the crossover, the idea of beneficence, doing good, benefiting people, avoiding harming them, and being just. Those are principles that we can share and which a lot of people in our society who are not believers would share with us. But the emphasis on obedience to God is, in a sense, the diametric opposite of the autonomy that's so highly valued in our society. So I wanted to point out that direct conflict. Here is a simple framework that I'll put up later. But the idea with this is to be able to have a systematic way of approaching difficult conundrums that do sometimes crop up. And I'll go through now a few simple cases. So this is the case of a young woman getting married next month. And she's come to see you because she's just had a contraceptive coil inserted, but then a friend at church has commented that the coil is not really a contraceptive because it kills babies. And now she's worried and wants to know what you think. Should she ask for it to be removed? And so this kind of question naturally leads most of us to start thinking about the complexities of the beginning of life. Does life begin at conception? Does it begin when the beginnings of a nervous system might be able to feel pain? Does it begin when a baby, if born early, would stand a chance of survival? Or does it simply begin at birth, which is the legal definition of when life begins in the UK? But actually, this is all a bit of a red herring, because the key here is to clarify the facts at the beginning. Because if we look at how these things work, all of them in normal use, and there are some exceptions which we could discuss if we got into it, but in terms of normal use, these contraceptives do prevent conception, so they operate at the earliest of these stages. And so if we were going to object to them, it would be because we objected to contraception in principle. So it's important to clarify exactly what the facts are. In a second case, this takes us into the complex area of prenatal ethics and other beginning of life questions. So a couple in their 30s, unable to have children, have discovered that she has a mitochondrial DNA mutation, and her parents have offered to pay for mitochondrial replacement therapy in the Ukraine, but his parents suggest staying in the UK where things are properly regulated and have IVF. So how would you counsel them? So this takes us into a multitude of questions with areas of science that are emerging and developing on a monthly basis at the moment, and they're increasingly complex. When it comes to prenatal diagnosis, this is what is written in a book on genome editing and human reproduction. Probably we've all heard of chorionic villus sampling and amniocentesis, both of which carry risks as procedures to the mother. New on the block is the non-invasive testing, simply a blood test. So not quite non-invasive, but no serious risk in terms of the pregnancy, but limited to specific conditions. And so now it's really very easy to do tests that will result in knowledge of problems such as Down's syndrome. And in one of the breakout groups earlier, somebody commented on looking at the beautiful picture of the chromosomes, that one of the pictures of the chromosomes, in fact, did show trisomy 21. It was the chromosomal pattern of someone with Down syndrome, and commented how beautiful that was, just as beautiful as the normal. And so one of the questions here is, with all these things available, how will we counsel women who are members of our church who are being offered these tests? You may remember the case of Professor He Jiankui in China. He faked some ethics approval forms and managed to make some changes which would protect the babies that were to be born from HIV infection. These were children who each had at least one parent with HIV infection. However, the worry was that the changes that were made may have increased the risk of these children to flu, which of course is a much higher risk. And so this raised all sorts of questions. The CRISPR technique that he used, the full name is written there for you to read, but the simple way to think of it is that you can now cut and paste gene editing. So in terms of gene editing, it's a bit like the invention of the printer. Instead of having to do everything slowly by hand, it's now possible to cut and paste at very high speed and at much lower cost. And then if we start thinking, is this appropriate? Well, there are, of course, corrective treatments when someone has a genetic problem or cancer. Maybe there are interventions that could help. Okay, that sounds good. What about treating degenerative changes, which are happening in all of us as we get older? Perhaps okay, slightly less comfortable for some. And then we get into the more selective approach. So we're no longer correcting anything. We're just saying, well, actually, I would like a child who's tall with blue eyes and so on. And so some of the challenges involved here are the idea of rejecting what is, from a human perspective, imperfect. The idea that the suspected mutation is deficient and should not be allowed to live, leading to termination, which is uncomfortable for all of us. It's also an imperfect technique. So one of the problems that is holding up the entire scientific community, regardless of beliefs, is that it's just not good enough yet to be too precise. But it also has worrying potential for misuse. If you want to reread a nice dystopian novel and think about the creation of alphas and epsilons, then you can just start imagining the potential misuse. And then, of course, there are some legal restrictions, but the problem with those is that they can backfire. And so restriction can perversely lead to unregulated development in inappropriate ways. And some of this stuff is really becoming extremely specific. So if you use this cut and paste technology and tie it to a base editor, you can really change just a single base pair of the DNA with remarkable precision. It's quite amazing. The condition that's associated, or one of the conditions that's associated with mitochondrial DNA problems is written about here by a medical student who had this condition. And they're not trivial. Some are fatal, but others are very serious and cause major problems for the person who carries the mutation. So it's not a trivial thing. And people have looked into solving this. One of the options is to try and replace the mitochondria in one of two ways. So the first way is to take a donor egg and get rid of the nucleus and use the nucleus from the mother, put that into the healthy egg, which of course hopefully has healthy mitochondrial DNA, and then combine that with the father's sperm to make a healthy egg. The problem with that is that not every egg is successfully fertilized, so it's quite inefficient. And this also, of course, introduces 3 people into the genetic lineage. And so this is where the term 3-parent babies comes from, if you've heard that term. Another technique is to say, well, let's actually do the transfer at a later stage in embryos, not just in eggs. And so you have a donor embryo from which you remove the nucleus, and you have the parent's embryo, and you put their nucleus into the hopefully healthy embryo from the donors. So I guess then technically you have a 4-parent embryo. So the problem here is that, at least with that second technique of pronuclear transfer, embryo destruction is intrinsic to the process. And we've still got questions about the safety. What does it mean that these genetic changes enter the germline? We're still figuring out what happens with IVF. And we know that there are increases in cardiovascular disease, so heart disease, high blood pressure, and so on, in children who are born as a result of IVF. And so there's going to be a lot of monitoring going on if these techniques do come forward. And there's commercial pressures, both on individuals, so it will be an amazing way to fund undergraduate education by selling some eggs, but also diversion of funds. So instead of researching the actual disease and how to treat it, let's just prevent it from happening. And we come back again to what are the options for this couple. So they could, of course, just not have children, but it's worth thinking through what are the all other options, and thinking widely about the choices that they've got, so that we can begin to have a conversation about the pros and cons of each of these options. Another example that comes up is difficulty in a professional role. So Karen's a psychologist struggling with offering psychological therapy to a client whose low mood is very much related to his sexual identity and stresses in a same-sex relationship. And a senior colleague has told her to get on with it and asked if she's homophobic. So she's worried about being accused of discrimination, but feels unable to help effectively. And what would you advise? So this raises various questions. The first is the area of conscientious objection. Is she being asked to do something that is actually wrong, or is it just something she dislikes doing? So of course this would apply to abortion in the UK. As a doctor, I don't have to be involved in that. I can say no, I don't want to do that. Similarly, doctors in the Netherlands can not be involved in euthanasia, but it doesn't routinely apply in most other contexts. And then there's the question of engaging with this client, but without endorsing what they're doing. So can Karen continue to provide therapy, but without giving at least tacit approval of the client's view of his sexuality? Is this realistic in terms of Karen's ability to compartmentalize her life? Should she have to do this? And of course, what about when the situation is reversed, like a Christian couple being pressured to accept screening for Down syndrome? So in a moment, I'm going to let you move on to discussing a couple of cases, or cases of your own, if that would be preferable. And you can use this framework or any other that you already have, that's fine. In a lot of these situations, it's not a simple black and white choice. Sometimes it is, but the most difficult ethical conundrums in bioethics are, of course, difficult because not everybody agrees. So there's an opportunity for grace But I do want to point you also to some resources. So I've listed some resources here at the bottom of the page, but also I'd encourage you to think about who are the go-to people in your own congregation who will be able to help on these questions. And also to think, how can we encourage and help members of our churches to engage in the conversation about bioethics, maintaining a biblical perspective, but also being respectful of the context that we're in and the new language of bioethics, which we're all having to learn to be part of the conversation.